I can absolutely help write a long, immersive original story inspired by that premise. However, I can't generate a full 90-minute narration in a single response because it exceeds my maximum response length. Instead, I'll write it as a serialized story that follows your requirements. Each part will end at a natural turning point, and when you reply continue, I'll seamlessly continue from the exact point where it stopped, maintaining consistency in the characters, timeline, and plot. I will also follow your requested style, a single continuous paragraph with no line breaks, original plot progression, cinematic pacing, varied scenes, and natural dialogue. Part 1. Long before maps carried the names of kingdoms now forgotten, when forests swallowed roads within a single season and every mountain seemed to hide a different god, there stood a fortress carved directly into the face of a black cliff overlooking an endless valley of silver mist. Travelers avoided even speaking of it because every tale ended differently. Some claimed the fortress had never been built by human hands. Others insisted it had once been a royal palace before its rulers traded mercy for impossible power. The oldest stories ignored both explanations and simply called it the Locked House, a place where every door opened inward except one. That final door was said to imprison the last witch powerful enough to frighten death itself. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and collapsed into dust, rivers changed course, languages drifted into silence, yet the final door remained sealed by chains that never rusted. No one remembered who forged them. No one remembered the woman's real name. They remembered only her title, the Enslaved Witch. On the morning everything began, rain fell across the valley with unusual patience, each drop sliding over ancient stone until it disappeared into cracks older than history. A young courier named Rowan guided his exhausted mule along a forgotten mountain path, muttering complaints to himself about impossible deliveries. His employer had promised extra silver if he delivered a sealed chest to an abandoned monastery before sunset. He had expected difficult roads, perhaps wolves, perhaps landslides, but not the strange silence surrounding the mountain. There were no birds. No insects. Even the wind seemed unwilling to touch the cliff walls. When the mule suddenly refused to move another step, Rowan tugged the rope several times before realizing the animal was trembling violently. "What has gotten into you?" he sighed, stroking its neck. The mule answered by pulling free and racing downhill, leaving the chest behind. Rowan watched in disbelief until the sound of hooves vanished beneath the rain. "Wonderful," he muttered. "Absolutely wonderful." Forced to carry the heavy chest himself, he continued uphill, though every instinct urged him to turn back. Half an hour later he reached the monastery, or rather what remained of it. Most of its towers had collapsed centuries earlier, vines twisting through shattered windows while moss softened broken statues of forgotten saints. Yet one structure remained strangely untouched by time. At the center of the ruins stood a circular hall surrounded by 12 stone pillars, each carved with symbols unlike any alphabet Rowan had ever seen. The air felt colder there. Not naturally cold, but deliberate, as though the temperature had been chosen by someone unseen. The delivery instructions had been simple: place the chest inside the circle and leave immediately. Rowan lowered the chest with a groan, wiped rainwater from his face, then noticed something that made him freeze. The chest had no lock. It had no hinges either. Curious despite himself, he ran his fingers along its polished surface until he discovered a tiny depression shaped exactly like a human thumb. "No," he whispered to himself. "I'm not being paid enough for mysterious boxes." He turned to leave, but thunder exploded overhead with such force that several loose stones crashed from the ruined walls, blocking the only exit beneath a mountain of debris. Rowan stared at the collapsed passage before looking slowly back toward the chest. "You're joking." The rain intensified. Somewhere beneath the floor came the faint sound of metal groaning against metal. It continued for several seconds before stopping completely. Rowan swallowed hard. He approached the chest again, telling himself there had to be a rational explanation. Ancient mechanisms. Shifting foundations. Nothing supernatural. He placed his thumb into the depression almost absent-mindedly, expecting nothing to happen. A sharp sting shot through his hand. He pulled back instinctively, but one drop of blood had already disappeared into the wood. The chest opened without making a sound. Inside rested nothing except a single black key wrapped in faded crimson cloth. Rowan blinked. That's it? The moment his fingers touched the key, every carved symbol surrounding the chamber ignited with pale blue light. Dust rained from the ceiling. Beneath his feet, enormous gears hidden for centuries awakened with deafening echoes. The floor split apart in 12 perfect sections, revealing a staircase descending into absolute darkness. Rowan backed away immediately. No. Definitely no. Then the staircase spoke. Finally. The voice belonged to a woman. Calm. Tired. Older than grief. Yet beneath its quiet surface lurked enough restrained strength to make every hair on Rowan's arms stand upright. How many kings have died while I waited? She asked softly. Rowan looked around in panic. Who's there? The one holding my key. Before he could answer, invisible force pulled him toward the staircase. He slammed against the stone floor, desperately gripping broken pillars while the black key slipped from his fingers and floated gently downward through the darkness. Chains began rattling somewhere far below. Thousands of them. Layer upon layer, like entire mountains wrapped in iron. Rowan shouted for help although he knew nobody lived within miles. The pulling force stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence returned. Heart pounding, Rowan crawled to the staircase and stared downward. Tiny lights appeared one after another beneath the earth, revealing an impossible cavern larger than cities he had only heard about in stories. Suspended above a bottomless abyss hung countless chains converging upon a single platform of white stone. Kneeling there was a woman dressed in faded gray robes. Her wrists, ankles, neck, and waist remained bound by glowing restraints connected to every chain stretching across the cavern. Her long black hair covered most of her face, yet even from that impossible distance Rowan sensed she was looking directly at him. Please, she said with surprising gentleness. Come closer. Every tale he had heard since childhood screamed inside his mind to run, but curiosity outweighed terror by the smallest margin. One careful step became another. The staircase seemed endless, spiraling downward until the monastery above disappeared entirely. The air grew warmer with each level, carrying scents of old incense, iron, and faint flowers that could not possibly bloom underground. At last Rowan reached the platform. The woman remained motionless. Up close she looked younger than her voice suggested, perhaps no older than 30, though exhaustion had carved shadows beneath her eyes. Strange silver markings covered her skin like rivers branching across pale stone. They pulsed faintly whenever the chains moved. You're alive, Rowan whispered. She smiled without joy. Unfortunately. He looked around nervously. Who chained you here? I did. Rowan frowned. That makes no sense. It will. She lifted her gaze fully for the first time. Her eyes were unlike anything human. One shimmered gold. The other reflected the deep blue of midnight oceans. Neither contained malice, only immeasurable weariness. Tell me, she continued quietly, what year is this? Rowan answered. She closed her eyes. Longer than I expected. Expected what? To survive. Before Rowan could ask another question, the cavern shook. Violently. Several chains snapped somewhere in the darkness with explosive cracks that echoed endlessly through the abyss. The witch's expression changed instantly. Calm vanished. Genuine alarm replaced it. Leave, she ordered. Rowan hesitated. Now. Her voice struck like thunder. At that exact moment black smoke poured from the broken chains, gathering into towering shapes with glowing crimson eyes. One creature dragged itself across the void on fractured links, its body resembling armor melted together with bone. Another emerged upside down, moving across empty air as though gravity had forgotten it existed. Rowan stumbled backward in horror. What are those? The reason I imprisoned myself. One monster lunged toward the platform. Before it reached them, the witch whispered a single word in an ancient language. Light erupted from the remaining chains, tearing through the creature until it dissolved into thousands of burning fragments. But the effort came at a cost. Fresh cracks spread across every restraint binding her body. She stared at them with quiet dread. "No," she murmured. "Not yet." More chains shattered across the cavern. More crimson eyes opened in the darkness. Rowan realized the prison was not breaking because someone was trying to free the witch. It was breaking because something else inside the abyss had finally become strong enough to break in. The witch looked directly at him once more, and this time there was no mystery left in her voice, only urgent determination. "If I remain sealed, they will eventually escape without me. If I free myself, I might still stop them. But once my seal is broken, the kingdoms above will hunt me before they believe a single word I say. So listen carefully, Rowan. In the next few minutes, you will decide whether history remembers you as the man who doomed the world, or the man who gave it one last chance." The silence after her words lasted no longer than the space between two heartbeats, yet to Rowan it felt like an entire lifetime compressed into a single impossible decision, because every lesson from his childhood insisted that witches destroyed kingdoms, while every instinct sharpened by the terror unfolding before his eyes warned him that the creatures clawing through the darkness represented something far older and far more dangerous than any story ever told around village fires. Another chain burst apart with a deafening crack that echoed across the abyss, followed by a chorus of distant shrieks unlike the voices of any living animal. They sounded hungry rather than angry, as though centuries of imprisonment had transformed patience into a sharper appetite than rage ever could. Rowan tightened his grip on the rough stone beneath his feet and forced himself to ask the only question that mattered. "If I free you, how do I know you won't become the next disaster?" The witch met his gaze without blinking. "You don't." The honesty of the answer struck harder than any promise could have. She did not attempt to persuade him with comforting words or impossible guarantees. Instead, she lowered her eyes toward the fractured chains around her wrists. "I sealed myself because I stopped trusting my own strength. That decision has not changed. But strength is no longer the greatest danger beneath this mountain." The platform lurched violently as a massive impact reverberated through the cavern. Chunks of stone rained from the ceiling while the glowing restraints dimmed for an instant before recovering. From somewhere beyond the circle of fading light came the scraping sound of countless claws dragging across rock. Rowan turned slowly. In the distance, dozens of crimson eyes had multiplied into hundreds. They floated at different heights, some close to the ground, others clinging upside down to invisible surfaces, still others suspended motionless like lanterns drifting through thick fog. The darkness itself seemed alive, breathing in slow waves around them. Then one pair of eyes vanished. A second later something landed silently on the edge of the platform. Rowan recoiled. The creature stood nearly twice the height of a man but possessed no recognizable shape. Black plates resembling cracked obsidian floated around a body composed entirely of swirling smoke, constantly assembling and collapsing into new forms. One moment it resembled a knight wearing ruined armor, the next a towering wolf with human hands instead of forelegs, then an eyeless giant whose ribs opened and closed like the gills of a fish. Every transformation happened without warning, making it impossible to understand where one body ended and another began. The creature tilted what might have been its head toward Rowan before speaking in a voice that sounded like several people whispering at once. "Little mortal." Rowan could not answer. "Give us the key." The witch's chains flared brilliantly. "Leave." The creature laughed, though laughter seemed an unnatural motion for something without lungs. "You cannot command us forever, Keeper." Keeper. Rowan noticed the title immediately. Not witch. Keeper. The creature continued circling the platform with slow confidence. "You have weakened. Your prison fractures. Your heartbeat slows. Even now the seal drinks more of your life than your body can spare." The witch remained silent. "Tell him," the creature urged with almost playful delight. "Tell your tiny guest what lies beneath the lowest chain." Rowan looked between them. "What does it mean?" The witch answered so quietly he almost missed it. "Nothing that concerns you." "A lie," hissed the creature. "Everything beneath this mountain concerns him now." Without warning it lunged. Rowan barely had time to raise an arm before the witch spoke another ancient word. Every remaining chain snapped taut simultaneously, releasing arcs of white light that struck the creature from every direction. It screamed as pieces of its smoky body disintegrated, yet even while burning it continued laughing until the final fragment vanished into drifting ash. Rowan stared in disbelief. You destroyed it. No. She looked toward the darkness. I delayed it. Sure enough, the ashes flowing across the platform did not settle. Instead they drifted back toward the abyss where countless other crimson eyes watched silently. Slowly the particles gathered again around another waiting silhouette. Rowan felt his stomach tighten. They can't die. Not while the prison exists. That doesn't make any sense. Few prisons are built to contain bodies. Another tremor rolled through the cavern, stronger than before. This time one of the 12 stone pillars supporting the platform cracked from top to bottom. A section collapsed into the abyss without ever striking a bottom. The witch inhaled sharply as another restraint around her left ankle splintered into glowing fragments. Rowan noticed something alarming. The silver markings across her skin had begun fading. Wherever they disappeared, small cracks spread through the stone platform itself. You're connected to this place, he realized. Every seal requires an anchor. And you're the anchor. She nodded once. When I bound myself, I tied my life to the prison. As long as I remain alive and chained, they remain below. Rowan swallowed. And if you die? She did not answer. She didn't need to. The silence itself became the answer. A sudden voice interrupted them, echoing down the staircase above. Search every chamber. Rowan spun toward the sound. More voices followed, clearer now. Metal boots striking stone. Armor clinking. Commands shouted with disciplined precision. The witch closed her eyes briefly. Too soon. Within moments a group of armored soldiers emerged onto the staircase carrying enchanted lanterns that glowed with pale green fire. Their polished breastplates bore the crest of a silver hawk gripping a broken sword. At their head marched a broad-shouldered commander with streaks of gray in his beard and an expression carved entirely from suspicion. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Rowan standing beside the chained woman. His sword left its sheath in one fluid motion. Step away from the prisoner. Rowan raised both hands. Wait, it's not what away. Several archers immediately aimed enchanted arrows toward the platform. The commander never looked away from the witch. By decree of the crown, the seal remains untouched. The witch regarded him with weary recognition. Another kingdom. Another commander. He frowned. You know me? No. I know your predecessors. One young soldier stared at her in visible confusion. She looks human. An older veteran beside him muttered, Don't let appearances deceive you. The commander addressed Rowan. Citizen, identify yourself. Rowan gave his name. Were you forced here? Rowan hesitated. Before he could respond, the witch interrupted. He owes me nothing. Remove him from this place. The commander narrowed his eyes. Interesting. You seek to protect him. No, she replied. I seek to protect your men. A few soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The commander ignored them. Our order has guarded this mountain for generations. We know every trick spoken by your kind. The witch tilted her head slightly. Do you? Another chain exploded behind her. This time the sound was followed by a roar so immense that every lantern flickered. Even the commander visibly stiffened. What was that? Rowan demanded. Nobody answered. Instead the roar came again, closer now, accompanied by rhythmic impacts as though something unimaginably large had begun climbing upward through the abyss itself. The crimson eyes scattered in every direction. For the first time the smaller creatures seemed afraid. The witch whispered, almost to herself, It has awakened. The commander barked orders immediately. Defensive formation. Soldiers locked shields together while archers repositioned along the staircase. The witch looked almost disappointed. You misunderstand your enemy. Silence. Your weapons will accomplish nothing. Enough. The commander raised a glowing seal attached to a silver chain around his neck. Ancient runes ignited across its surface. By the authority granted to the wardens of the Ninth Covenant, I reinforce the prison. The seal flashed brilliantly. For one hopeful second the broken chains surrounding the witch began repairing themselves. Then the roar came a third time. The light shattered like fragile glass. Every rune on the commander's relic blackened instantly. He stared in horror as the sacred artifact crumbled into ash inside his hand. Impossible, he whispered. The witch spoke without triumph. Only regret. Whoever forged that covenant has been dead for centuries. The mountain shook with such violence that several soldiers lost their footing. From beneath the platform rose a colossal shape larger than a cathedral tower. At first Rowan believed it to be another cliff emerging from darkness until two enormous golden eyes opened across its surface. Unlike the crimson-eyed creatures, these eyes contained no hatred. They contained nothing at all. Absolute emptiness stared back at the world. The massive being continued rising slowly, revealing a body formed from black stone wrapped in chains thicker than castle walls. Entire staircases had been carved into its shoulders by ancient builders long forgotten. Broken temples clung to its back like abandoned nests. It was less a creature than a moving mountain imprisoned beneath another mountain. Every smaller shadow fled from its approach. Even the witch lowered her head as though acknowledging an old and terrible acquaintance. Rowan found enough breath to whisper, "What is that?" She answered without looking away from the impossible giant. "The first prisoner." The words seemed to drain every remaining sound from the cavern because even the soldiers, disciplined through years of relentless training, forgot their commands and stared upward as the immense figure continued its slow ascent through the darkness beneath the platform. Stone groaned against stone. Chains stretched until they sang with a deep metallic note that vibrated through Rowan's bones. Dust drifted from the ceiling in shimmering curtains while fragments of ancient masonry broke loose from distant walls and disappeared into the abyss. The commander's breathing grew heavier, though he forced himself to stand firm. "Archers," he said, his voice rougher than before, "hold your aim." None of the archers lowered their bows, yet none seemed eager to release a single arrow. The witch watched the giant with an expression that mixed recognition and sorrow. "You should not have awakened," she murmured. The enormous eyes shifted toward her. For several endless seconds nothing happened. Then the giant spoke. Its voice did not emerge from a mouth but from every stone surrounding them, every chain hanging across the void, every crack hidden inside the mountain itself. "Neither should you." Rowan instinctively covered his ears, yet the words bypassed hearing entirely, resonating inside his thoughts with crushing weight. Several younger soldiers collapsed to one knee, clutching their heads. One began sobbing uncontrollably without understanding why. The commander forced himself upright through sheer determination. "What in the gods' names are you?" The giant did not acknowledge him. Its empty gaze remained fixed on the witch. "Keeper," it said. "Your strength fades. I know. Your heartbeat weakens. I know. Your prison fails. I know." There was no anger between them, no triumph, only the solemn exchange of two beings who had shared an unbearable duty for longer than civilizations had existed. Rowan found the courage to step forward despite every instinct urging him to retreat. "If you were in prison too, then why are those things afraid of you?" The giant's eyes moved to him for the first time. "Because they remember." Before Rowan could ask what they remembered, dozens of crimson-eyed creatures burst from the darkness simultaneously, racing across chains, pillars, and empty air with frantic speed. Unlike before, they ignored the humans completely. Every one of them hurled itself toward the giant. The commander shouted, "Loose!" A storm of enchanted arrows streaked across the cavern. Some struck the creatures directly, exploding into brilliant silver fire. Others passed harmlessly through smoke-like bodies. The impact slowed several monsters but destroyed none. They continued surging toward the colossal prisoner. The giant did not defend itself. It simply raised one hand, an immense slab of living stone wrapped in broken chains, and allowed the first wave of creatures to crash against it. The instant they touched its surface, every crimson-eyed monster froze. Their screams became silent. One by one they hardened into black crystal before shattering into glittering fragments that drifted through the air like frozen snow. Hundreds more followed. None reached beyond the giant's outstretched hand. Rowan stared in astonishment. It can destroy them. No, the witch replied quietly. It reminds them what they truly are. The commander looked sharply toward her. Explain. She hesitated for the first time since Rowan had met her. There are truths that have protected this world precisely because they were forgotten. The world is ending beneath our feet, the commander snapped. I believe we have passed the point where secrets are useful. The witch almost smiled. You think that now? Another tremor interrupted them, different from the previous ones. This one carried rhythm. Boom. 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 Each impact echoed from somewhere above rather than below. The commander frowned. That's impossible. A soldier near the staircase pointed upward. Commander! Everyone looked. Hairline cracks were spreading across the ceiling of the cavern, not from the prison breaking beneath them but from something striking the mountain from outside. Stone splintered. Dust thickened until breathing became difficult. Then sunlight pierced the darkness in dozens of brilliant beams as the ceiling collapsed inward. Massive boulders rained into the abyss. Soldiers scattered. Rowan threw himself behind a broken pillar just before a block of stone smashed into the platform where he had been standing. Through the widening hole above descended enormous iron hooks attached to chains lowered from the surface. Dozens of armored figures repelled downward with astonishing speed. Their armor was unlike that of the commander's men. Instead of polished steel, they wore matte black plates engraved with crimson circles. Every soldier moved with perfect coordination, saying nothing as they landed around the platform. The commander immediately recognized them. The Ash Dominion. His expression hardened with open hatred. One of the newcomers removed a helmet, revealing a woman with close-cropped white hair and a narrow scar crossing one eye. She surveyed the cavern with unsettling calm before smiling faintly. So the legends were true after all. Her gaze settled on the witch. We've been searching for you for generations. The commander stepped between them. General Seraphine. Commander Aldrin. She inclined her head politely. Still guarding ruins for a kingdom that barely remembers your order exists? Still serving tyrants who burn every village that questions them? She shrugged. Efficiency has always offended idealists. Her attention returned to the witch. Forgive the delay. Excavating an entire mountain required more time than anticipated. Rowan blinked. You caused the cave-in? Of course. She glanced at him with mild curiosity. And you are? Nobody. Nobody rarely stands beside immortal prisoners. The witch interrupted before Rowan could answer further. Seraphine. Keeper. The two women regarded one another with unmistakable familiarity. Rowan noticed it immediately. You know each other. Seraphine laughed softly. Not personally. Professionally. The witch's expression remained unreadable. Your predecessors failed. Repeatedly. Seraphine nodded without embarrassment. Fortunately, history allows descendants to learn from failure. She raised one hand. Her soldiers rolled forward a heavy object covered by black cloth. With a dramatic pull, she revealed what lay beneath. Rowan's blood ran cold. It was another chain. Unlike those binding the witch, this one gleamed with polished silver and intricate blue runes. It seemed newly forged despite resembling the ancient restraints around the platform. The witch's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Impossible. Seraphine noticed. That expression alone made the expedition worthwhile. Who built it? Several thousand unwilling scholars over 83 years. They did not possess the knowledge. No. Seraphine smiled. You did. Confusion swept across Rowan's face. The witch slowly understood. My journals. Every page your enemies failed to destroy eventually found its way into our archives. Seraphine rested one hand upon the new chain. Remarkable work, truly. It took generations to decipher your handwriting. The commander looked horrified. You recreated the first seal? An imitation, Seraphine corrected. Not perfect. But sufficient. The witch's voice grew colder than the cavern itself. You have no idea what you've made. On the contrary. Seraphine's confidence never wavered. I know exactly what it does. Unlike the kingdoms that buried you, we have no interest in worshipping old fears. We intend to control them. The giant finally shifted its gaze toward Seraphine. For the first time since its appearance, a faint change crossed its expressionless face. It was not anger. It was pity. Child, the colossal prisoner said, chains are never loyal. Seraphine answered without hesitation. Neither is power left unused. She raised her arm sharply. Every black-armored soldier activated crystal devices attached to their belts. Brilliant blue light spread through the cavern as the newly forged chain lifted into the air, each link rotating independently while ancient runes awakened one after another. Rowan felt an overwhelming pressure settle across his shoulders. Even breathing became difficult. The witch immediately understood the danger. Rowan, she said firmly, when I tell you to run, you do not argue. What are they doing? Replacing the prison. Isn't that what we need? No. She looked directly into his eyes. Because they are removing the only person who knows how to keep it closed. Before Rowan could respond, the artificial chain shot across the platform like a living serpent. It wrapped around the witch's wrists with astonishing precision. Every original restraint shattered simultaneously, exploding into showers of white light that illuminated the entire abyss. For one breathtaking instant she stood completely free, no chains touching her for the first time in countless centuries. The silver markings covering her skin blazed brighter than the sun. A wave of raw magical force erupted outward, flattening soldiers from both armies, extinguishing every lantern, and sending Rowan sliding across the stone until his back struck the base of a broken pillar. The cavern itself seemed to inhale. Every crimson-eyed creature screamed in unison. The giant closed its eyes. And the witch, no longer kneeling but standing at her full height, slowly opened and closed her hands as though remembering what freedom felt like after an age of captivity. Then she looked at the glowing imitation chain trying desperately to tighten around her wrists, and in a voice almost too soft to hear she said, "You copied the lock." She lifted one hand effortlessly. "You forgot to ask why I forged the key." The artificial chain tightened with a violent metallic shriek as every rune carved into its polished links ignited at once, flooding the cavern with cold blue light. Seraphine did not flinch. Instead she smiled with the calm confidence of someone watching years of preparation unfold exactly as planned. "Increase the binding," she ordered. Her soldiers drove iron staffs into cracks across the platform. Thin streams of luminous energy raced from one staff to another until they formed a perfect circle around the witch. The runes pulsed faster, each pulse sending another wave of invisible pressure through the chamber. Rowan struggled to rise, but his legs refused to obey. It felt as though the mountain itself had settled onto his shoulders. Nearby, Commander Aldrin forced himself upright by planting his sword into the stone and using it as a crutch. "Fall back," he shouted to his remaining soldiers. "Get away from the center." Several obeyed immediately, dragging wounded companions toward the staircase, but others stood frozen, unable to decide whether they were witnessing the greatest victory in history or its final mistake. The witch examined the glowing links wrapped around her wrists with unsettling curiosity. She turned her hand slowly, listening to the chain sing as thousands of runes attempted to read the magic flowing through her body. Then she laughed. It was not triumphant laughter, nor cruel laughter, but the quiet amusement of a master craftswoman discovering that someone had faithfully copied every decorative detail of a lock while misunderstanding the mechanism hidden inside it. Seraphine's smile faded a fraction. "Report." One of her engineers knelt beside a crystal instrument covered in rotating brass rings. His confidence evaporated as he stared at the spinning needles. "General, the readings. Speak clearly. The seal isn't drawing power from the prisoner." Seraphine frowned. "Impossible. It's..." He swallowed hard. "It's feeding her." For the first time uncertainty crossed Seraphine's face. The witch looked up. "Every prison is in agreement," she said. "You believe these chains suppressed what they touched?" "They never did. They redirected what they touched." She raised her bound hands. The blue light surrounding the artificial chain abruptly changed direction. Instead of pressing inward, it flowed into her like rivers finding the sea. The silver markings across her skin blazed brighter, spreading across her neck and face in intricate patterns that resembled living constellations. Cracks that exhaustion had carved beneath her eyes disappeared. Her posture straightened. Color returned to her cheeks. Centuries of fatigue dissolved in seconds. The giant opened its enormous eyes once more. "You have restored her." Seraphine immediately drew her sword. "Break the chain." Dozens of soldiers rushed forward with enchanted hammers, axes, and hooked blades designed to dismantle magical restraints. The first hammer struck the glowing links with tremendous force. Instead of damaging the chain, the impact exploded backward. The soldier flew through the air, crashing into a distant pillar before collapsing motionless. Two more attacked together. Their weapons disintegrated into glittering dust the instant they touched the runes. The witch remained perfectly still throughout the assault. "Stop," she warned. "Do not force it to defend itself." Nobody listened. An engineer activated a crystal cannon mounted on a collapsible frame. A concentrated beam of white fire slammed into the chain. The entire cavern flashed. Rowan instinctively shielded his eyes. When his vision cleared, the cannon had melted into molten metal while the artificial chain gleamed more brightly than before. The witch sighed. "You built it to survive anything." Seraphine stepped forward herself. "Then I will end this another way." She drew a narrow dagger from inside her. Armor. Unlike her sword, the blade appeared completely ordinary, forged from dull gray steel without enchantments or ornamentation. The witch's expression changed the instant she saw it. "Where did you find that?" "Buried beneath the eastern desert." Seraphine twirled it once before pointing it directly at the witch's heart. "Remarkably plain for something older than empires." The giant spoke before anyone else could. "Do not use it." Seraphine glanced upward. "Interesting. So it matters. You do not understand what you carry." "I don't need to." She lunged. The movement happened with astonishing speed. Rowan barely registered the motion before Seraphine crossed the platform, slipping between streams of magical light with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the attack countless times. Her dagger thrust toward the witch's chest. At the last possible instant the witch stepped aside. No explosion of magic followed. No dazzling spell erupted. She simply moved with impossible grace, allowing the blade to pass within a finger's width of her robe. Seraphine pivoted immediately, slashing again. The witch avoided the strike by turning her shoulders. Another thrust. Another effortless evasion. Rowan watched in disbelief. "Why isn't she fighting back?" Aldrin answered without taking his eyes off the duel. "Because she's studying her." The witch's gaze followed every movement of the ancient dagger rather than Seraphine herself. After the sixth exchange she finally spoke. "You truly don't know." Seraphine attacked again. "Know what? That isn't a weapon." She caught Seraphine's wrist. The entire platform fell silent. Seraphine struggled to pull away but found her arm completely immobile despite the witch using only one hand. The witch gently took the dagger from her fingers. "It's a tool." She held it up for everyone to see. "This carved the first runes." Rowan stared. "The first?" "Not the first magical runes. She turned the blade so its edge reflected the distant light. The first words ever written. Even the giant bowed its head slightly toward the humble gray blade. Language, it rumbled, was born from that edge. The witch brushed one fingertip along the metal. Ancient symbols appeared briefly in the air before fading again. Every seal. Every spell. Every covenant. Every curse. They all descend from marks first carved by this. Seraphine's confidence finally fractured. You're lying. No. The witch offered the dagger back to her hilt first. Your ancestors mistook a pen for a knife. Seraphine hesitated before accepting it. For the first time she seemed genuinely uncertain. Before anyone could speak further, the giant suddenly looked upward. The mountain breaks. A deafening crack echoed through the cavern. Then another. Entire walls split apart. Torrents of water burst through fresh fractures as underground rivers changed course. The ceiling continued collapsing in widening circles. Far above, daylight poured into the abyss through enormous wounds ripped across the mountain. Rowan heard distant screams carried down from the surface. There are people up there, he shouted. The witch closed her eyes briefly as though listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them again, urgency had replaced every trace of calm. The foundation has failed. Aldrin frowned. Because of the excavation? No. She looked toward the giant. Because the prison no longer has a heart. Rowan blinked. You were the heart. Exactly. The realization spread across every face at once. By freeing her even accidentally, they had removed the living anchor holding together not only the magical prison but the mountain surrounding it. Entire sections of the abyss began collapsing inward. Pillars toppled one after another into the darkness below. Chains snapped in rapid succession until the cavern filled with constant thunder. The crimson-eyed creatures did not attack. They fled, racing through every opening they could find. The giant watched them go without moving. They escape. Can you stop them? Rowan shouted. Not. While I remain bound. Rowan looked toward the colossal chains wrapped around the giant's body. Most remained intact despite the destruction around them. Then understanding struck him. You're still imprisoned. The giant regarded him with empty golden eyes. Yes. The witch stepped toward the edge of the platform, her robes whipping violently in the rushing wind pouring through the collapsing mountain. If I release you, the world will remember why it feared my name. And if I don't? The giant turned its gaze toward the crimsonite swarm disappearing into the widening cracks above. The world will forget it ever existed. Seraphine stepped beside the witch, breathing heavily after the duel. You can't be considering this. I'm considering mathematics. Mathematics? One prisoner, or millions of dead? Seraphine looked toward the escaping creatures, then back at the giant. For the first time in her career, every carefully prepared strategy had dissolved into impossible choices. Aldrin approached as well, lowering his sword. If we free it, can it be imprisoned again? The giant answered before the witch could. Perhaps. That's not an answer. It is the only honest one. Another section of the mountain collapsed, opening a vast window to the outside world. Rowan could now see forests stretching beyond the cliff, tiny villages nestled in distant valleys, smoke rising peacefully from chimneys whose owners had no idea that an ancient catastrophe was climbing toward them through the broken heart of a mountain. The witch followed his gaze, and something in her expression softened, not with fear, but with resolve. She had imprisoned herself to save a world that had forgotten her sacrifice, and now that same world stood balanced upon another unbearable decision. Slowly she lifted the ordinary gray dagger, turned toward the immense chains binding the first prisoner, and whispered, once before, I carved the words that closed a door. I pray I still remember how to write the ones that open it. The gray blade appeared almost insignificant in her hand, a plain strip of worn metal held against chains that dwarfed towers, yet the instant its edge approached the nearest link the entire cavern reacted as though it had recognized an old master returning after an age of absence. Every remaining chain hummed in the same low note. The silver markings across the witch's skin brightened until they resembled flowing rivers beneath clear ice. Dust that had been falling through the air suddenly stopped. Pebbles hung motionless. Even the torrents of water bursting through fractured walls froze into glittering arcs that curved through the cavern like transparent glass. Rowan blinked in confusion before realizing time itself had not stopped. Only motion near the blade had slowed until every heartbeat seemed to last several breaths. The witch rested the dagger gently against one colossal link. She did not strike. She did not force it. Instead, she traced a single curved line across the black metal. There was no shower of sparks, no screech of steel grinding against steel. The chain opened as quietly as a thread slipping from cloth. The severed halves drifted apart without falling, dissolving into drifting letters that floated upward like leaves carried by invisible wind. Rowan stared in amazement. Each fragment had become a symbol, unfamiliar yet strangely beautiful, and every symbol vanished only after whispering a sound too faint to understand. "You aren't cutting it," he breathed. "You're." The witch nodded without looking away from her work, erasing the sentence that told it to remain closed. Seraphine watched the disappearing letters with growing disbelief. Years of study, decades of excavations, generations of sacrifice had taught her to think of magic as force shaped by discipline. What she witnessed now resembled language rather than power. The chain had obeyed because it had been spoken out of existence. "Impossible," one of her surviving engineers whispered. "No," the witch replied calmly. "Simply older." Another immense link awaited. She carved a different mark. This chain did not dissolve. Instead it folded inward, shrinking until it became a ring no larger than a bracelet before settling silently upon the platform. A third transformed into fine silver dust. A fourth unraveled into strands of glowing light that drifted toward the ceiling and disappeared into the widening cracks. Every chain carried a different instruction, and every instruction required a different answer. Rowan realized she was not repeating a spell but composing one, adapting each word to what lay before her. The giant remained perfectly still throughout the process. It neither hurried her nor thanked her. It simply watched with the patience of something that had measured waiting in centuries rather than days. Around them the mountain continued collapsing. Great slabs of stone plunged into the abyss while entire galleries carved by forgotten civilizations crumbled into ruin. Far above, frightened voices echoed through the fractures. Bells rang from distant villages. Birds burst from the forests in enormous black clouds. Outside, the cliff itself had begun splitting from summit to base. Aldrin glanced upward with increasing alarm. "We don't have much time." "I know," the witch answered. "Then why are you moving so carefully?" "Because haste is how prisons become tombs." A violent tremor interrupted her. One of the suspended hooks left behind by Seraphine's excavation snapped loose from the ceiling, swinging wildly across the cavern. It smashed through two remaining pillars before hurtling directly toward Rowan. He barely managed to dive aside. The enormous iron hook struck the platform with explosive force, carving a deep trench through the stone. The impact shattered the bracelet-sized chain the witch had set aside. The tiny ring exploded into a halo of silver fragments. The giant's eyes widened for the first time. No. The fragments did not vanish. They spun through the air, circling one another faster and faster until they formed a whirlpool of shining dust. Rowan scrambled backward. What happened? The witch's expression hardened. That chain wasn't destroyed. The silver vortex expanded rapidly. It was interrupted. From its center emerged a hand. Human in shape. Pale as moonlight. Then another. A face followed, neither old nor young, with closed eyes and hair woven from countless silver threads. The figure stepped gracefully onto the platform wearing robes that shimmered like mirrored water. It opened its eyes. Rowan involuntarily stepped back. They contained no pupils, only endless white light. The newcomers surveyed the ruined cavern with quiet disappointment before focusing on the witch. "You always were impatient." The witch lowered the dagger slightly. Archivist. The figure inclined its head. Keeper. Seraphine looked from one to the other. Who is this? The archivist answered before the witch could. A witness. Its voice carried no emotion whatsoever, sounding less like speech than a perfectly remembered recording. I preserve what has been written. I observe what is rewritten. Rowan frowned. You've been inside the chain? Not inside. The archivist smiled faintly. As the chain. Nobody understood except the witch. She closed her eyes briefly. I hoped you had finally gone. Records do not leave voluntarily. The giant spoke in a tone almost respectful. Old friend. The archivist turned toward the immense prisoner. First voice. The title echoed strangely through the chamber. Rowan caught it immediately. First voice? The archivist looked at him as though noticing him for the first time. Yes. Rowan gestured toward the giant. I thought it was the first prisoner. It is. Then why call it first voice? Silence settled over the platform. Even the witch did not answer immediately. At last the archivist spoke. Because before it became the first prisoner, it looked toward the colossal figure. It was the first being to speak. Rowan's thoughts stumbled over the idea. That's impossible. History often appears impossible after enough pages are burned. The giant remained expressionless. Names have little value now. They have every value, the archivist corrected. Names are how memory survives. Seraphine stepped forward. Enough riddles. She pointed her sword toward the giant. Tell us plainly. What is it? The archivist regarded her with mild curiosity. Your empire called it a monster. It turned toward Aldrin. His kingdom called it a god. It finally looked at Rowan. Neither word is correct. Then what? Rowan asked. The archivist's answer came softly. It taught silence how to become language. Nobody spoke. The sentence hung in the air, beautiful and incomprehensible. The witch finally sighed. You always explain too early. And you always explain too late. Another roar thundered through the collapsing mountain, but this one came not from below. It echoed across the valleys outside. Rowan hurried toward the widening breach overlooking the world. His breath caught. Far below, streams of crimson-eyed creatures poured from dozens of newly opened fissures across the mountainside. They moved with terrifying speed through forests, across rivers, over cliffs, scattering wildlife in every direction. Some villages had already spotted them. Tiny figures fled through fields while bells continued ringing desperately. Smoke rose where buildings had begun burning. They're out, Rowan whispered. Aldrin joined him and cursed under his breath. Messenger hawks won't reach the capital in time. They don't need to, Seraphine said unexpectedly. Everyone turned toward her. She had removed a crystal cylinder from inside her armor. Fine cracks spread across its surface as energy gathered within. What is that? Rowan asked. The ash beacon. Seraphine held it carefully. Every fortress of the Dominion can see its light. Aldrin frowned. You'll warn your own army. I will warn everyone. She met his eyes steadily. Borders lose importance when nightmares begin crossing them. Aldrin searched her face for deception. Finding none, he slowly nodded. Do it. Seraphine shattered the crystal against the stone. Instead of falling, the fragments shot upward through the broken ceiling as a single pillar of crimson light that pierced the clouds high above the mountain. Seconds later the heavens answered. Far on the horizon, another crimson beam appeared. Then another. Then a blue one. Then gold. Across distant kingdoms, across lands divided by centuries of war, ancient warning towers awakened one after another, each answering the signal in its own color until the entire horizon glittered with columns of light stretching from one end of the world to the other. Rowan watched in awe. They're responding. Aldrin smiled grimly. Every nation remembers one lesson. Which one? When the old beacons burn. He looked toward the escaping swarm spreading through the valleys below. Everyone is already too late. The forest beneath the shattered mountain seemed to ripple as the crimson-eyed creatures disappeared beneath its canopy, not moving as a single army but scattering in countless directions like sparks carried by a violent wind. Some leaped impossible distances from cliff to cliff while others slipped directly into the shadows cast by ancient pines, vanishing without leaving so much as a footprint. Rowan searched desperately for patterns until he realized there were none. They were not invading. They were searching. The thought chilled him more deeply than if they had marched in orderly ranks. They're looking for something, he said aloud. The witch followed his gaze. Someone. Before Rowan could ask who, the mountain convulsed with another violent shudder. A section of the cavern floor peeled away, exposing a vast chamber hidden beneath the platform itself. Unlike the abyss surrounding them, this newly revealed space had smooth white walls untouched by time. Hundreds of stone shelves stretched into the darkness, each one empty except for a faint outline left by objects long since removed. The archivist looked down with an expression that almost resembled nostalgia. So they found it at last. Seraphine stared. Found what? The library. Rowan frowned. It's empty. Now it is. The archivist stepped toward the edge and watched fragments of polished stone tumble into the forgotten chamber. Once every promise, every treaty, every spell, every name, every birth, every death, every star chart, every map of every coast that no longer exists rested here. Aldrin looked around in disbelief. Who took them? People. The answer was so ordinary that nobody immediately responded. The archivist continued. Knowledge has always escaped prisons more easily than prisoners. The witch finally resumed carving through the remaining colossal restraints surrounding the giant. Only 5 chains remained intact. Each seemed heavier than the last, their surfaces covered not with runes but with countless names carved in impossibly small letters. Rowan walked closer, squinting until he realized every name belonged to a different language. Some he could not even pronounce in his mind. Why are there names instead of symbols? He asked. The witch traced her fingers across one weathered inscription. Because these chains were not forged from iron. Rowan looked confused. Then what are they made of? Oaths. She glanced at him. Every civilization that feared the first voice added another promise that it would never walk freely again. Every promise became another link. Rowan stared at the chain with new understanding. So all these names. Those who swore them. Aldrin approached slowly, reading one weathered inscription aloud. It belonged to a kingdom erased from history centuries before his own nation had existed. Another name belonged to a civilization remembered only through children's myths. Others were entirely unfamiliar. They're all gone, he whispered. Kingdoms die, the witch replied. Promises remain. Seraphine folded her arms thoughtfully. If the kingdoms no longer exist, why haven't the chains weakened? Because words outlive the mouths that speak them. The archivist smiled faintly. That has always been both humanity's greatest strength and greatest curse. Suddenly a young Ash Dominion soldier stumbled toward Seraphine, blood running down one side of his face. He had been helping the wounded near the staircase. General, he gasped. There's someone else. Seraphine frowned. Another prisoner? No. He pointed toward the newly revealed library beneath the platform. A child. Everyone froze. Rowan looked down into the white chamber. At first he saw only fallen masonry and broken shelves. Then, near the center of the ruined library, a small figure stepped cautiously into view. A little girl no older than 8 stood barefoot among the rubble wearing a simple gray dress covered in dust. Her dark hair hung loosely over her shoulders. She carried no weapon, no lantern, nothing at all. She looked up toward the platform as though she had been expecting them. Rowan blinked in confusion. How did she get down there? Nobody answered because nobody knew. The child tilted her head curiously before calling upward in a perfectly ordinary voice. "You're making a terrible mess." The absurdity of the complaint left everyone speechless. Stones continued crashing from the ceiling. Entire walls split apart. Yet the girl sounded mildly annoyed rather than frightened. Rowan cupped his hands around his mouth. "Who are you?" She considered the question seriously. "I don't remember." The archivist looked sharply toward her. For the first time since appearing, genuine surprise crossed its otherwise unreadable face. "Impossible." The girl noticed the silverite figure and smiled brightly. "Oh. You're awake. You can see me?" the archivist asked. "Of course." She looked puzzled. "Why wouldn't I?" The archivist fell silent. The witch stopped carving. Even the giant lowered its immense head toward the child. Rowan sensed the atmosphere change instantly. Whatever danger had been unfolding around them, the little girl somehow mattered just as much. She wandered casually through the ruined library, examining empty shelves with childlike curiosity. "Everything's gone," she observed sadly. "That's disappointing." Seraphine called down, "How long have you been there?" "A while." "How long is a while?" The girl shrugged. "I got bored counting after the stars changed." Aldrin exchanged a glance with Rowan. "She's speaking nonsense." "No," the archivist whispered. "She's speaking literally." Rowan looked toward it. "Who is she?" The archivist did not answer immediately. Instead it descended gracefully into the ruined library without touching the collapsing staircases, stopping a few paces before the child. "State your designation." The girl frowned. "That's a rude way to introduce yourself." "Please." She smiled. "That's better." The archivist waited. The child tapped one finger thoughtfully against her chin. "I think." She closed her eyes. "People used to call me." For a brief instant every remaining chain around the giant vibrated violently. The crimson-eyed creatures visible outside the mountain all stopped moving at exactly the same moment. Birds circling overhead dropped silently from the sky. Even the wind vanished. The girl opened her eyes. "Tomorrow." The silence that followed felt heavier than stone. Rowan stared blankly. "Tomorrow?" She nodded happily. "It's a lovely name, isn't it?" The archivist took one careful step backward. The witch's face had gone completely pale. Seraphine looked from one immortal being to the other. "Somebody tell me why that matters." The giant answered. "Because there was never meant to be a tomorrow." Rowan laughed nervously. "That doesn't make sense." The witch finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the first language was written." She looked down at the smiling child. "There were words for yesterday." She looked toward the giant. "There were words for today." Her eyes returned to the girl. But the future had no name. Rowan felt his pulse quicken. Then the archivist finished the thought. "Someone wrote one." The child looked mildly embarrassed. "I wasn't supposed to." Seraphine rubbed her temples. "Are we truly discussing grammar while monsters are escaping?" "We are discussing why the world continues to have mornings," the archivist replied. The child wandered toward a cracked shelf and gently brushed dust away with her sleeve. Hidden beneath the debris lay a tiny wooden toy carved in the shape of a bird. She picked it up with quiet delight. "I remember this." She smiled to herself. Someone made it while waiting for the rain to stop. Rowan watched her closely. "You remember whoever lived here?" "No." She shook her head. "I remember everyone." Before Rowan could process the statement, one of the crimson-eyed creatures burst through the broken wall of the library below. It ignored every adult. It ignored the witch. It ignored the giant. It raced directly toward the little girl with desperate speed, not attacking but reaching, almost pleading. Found. It hissed in a dozen overlapping voices. Found. The child turned toward it without fear. Hello. The creature extended one smoke-like hand. Come, home. The giant roared. The sound shook the mountain harder than any collapse before it. Do not touch her. At the same instant the witch leaped from the platform, descending toward the library in a blur of silver light, while the archivist thrust out one glowing hand and Seraphine hurled the ancient grey blade through the air. For impossible events converged upon one frightened child in the same heartbeat, each arriving a fraction too late as the creature's trembling fingertips brushed the girl's hand, and the instant their skin met, every crimson-eyed monster across the world lifted its head toward the sky and spoke the same single word together. Remember. The word rolled across mountains, deserts, oceans, and forgotten ruins with impossible speed, not carried by air but by memory itself. In distant villages shepherds looked up from their flocks without knowing why tears suddenly filled their eyes. Sailors crossing calm seas dropped their ropes as forgotten dreams resurfaced for a heartbeat before slipping away again. Elderly women paused in the middle of familiar prayers because a different prayer, one they had never learned yet somehow recognized, briefly echoed inside their minds. Children stopped laughing in marketplaces and stared toward the horizon as though expecting someone who had been gone for far too long. Across the world people experienced the same sensation, not the arrival of something new, but the return of something they had once known so completely that losing it had left an invisible wound in every generation that followed. Rowan gasped as the cavern around him dissolved into overlapping images. He remained standing on the broken platform, yet he also stood in places he had never seen. Endless plains covered with flowers taller than horses. Cities built from pale stone that reflected starlight even during the day. Towers that floated above rivers without pillars. Forests where every leaf glowed softly after sunset. None of the visions lasted more than an instant before another replaced them. They did not feel like dreams. They felt like memories borrowed from strangers. Voices surrounded him, thousands speaking at once in languages he did not understand, yet every sentence carried the same emotion, hope without fear. Then the visions ended as abruptly as they had begun. Rowan staggered, clutching his head. Around him soldiers from both armies struggled to remain standing. Some wept openly. Others laughed in stunned disbelief. One old veteran whispered the name of a woman who had died decades earlier before collapsing to his knees. Aldrin wiped tears from his face with visible confusion. I remembered my mother singing. He frowned. Except she never knew that song. Seraphine stared silently at her own hands. The witch landed gently beside the child just as the archivist's outstretched light enveloped the crimson-eyed creature. Instead of burning, the creature simply stopped moving. Its smoky body rippled like disturbed water. The child looked at it with sympathy. You remembered too much all at once. The creature trembled violently. Crimson light flickered inside its eyes before fading into deep amber. Its monstrous form shrank. Smoke condensed into flesh. Armor dissolved into worn cloth. Within seconds a frightened young man knelt where the creature had stood, breathing as though he had surfaced after drowning. He stared at his own hands in utter disbelief. His voice cracked. Alive? Nobody moved. Rowan looked from the bewildered stranger to the countless crimson-eyed creatures still visible fleeing through the valleys outside. What just happened? The witch slowly lowered the dagger she had caught after Seraphine's throw. That wasn't a monster. Rowan frowned. It attacked us. No. She looked toward the trembling man. It forgot itself. Silence followed. The implications spread gradually through the chamber until horror replaced confusion. Seraphine found her voice first. You're saying every one of those creatures was once someone. The archivist completed the sentence quietly. Rowan stared toward the mountains where thousands of crimson figures still raced across the landscape. No. Yes. The witch closed her eyes briefly. Every civilization called them demons because no one remained alive who remembered the people they had been. Aldrin looked physically ill. How? The giant answered from above, its voice carrying deep sorrow. Memory abandoned them. Rowan struggled to understand. People don't become monsters because they forget things. Ordinary forgetting, the archivist replied. No. It looked toward the child. But when the future itself disappears. The child named Tomorrow lowered her gaze sadly. Everyone began losing pieces of themselves. Rowan looked between them. I don't understand. The witch drew a slow breath. Imagine living without believing there will be another sunrise. Rowan frowned. Nobody would. Exactly. She looked at him. Not because the sun would stop rising. Because no one would possess the idea that life continues beyond today. Rowan's mind slowly assembled the impossible truth. Tomorrow isn't just a word. The child smiled faintly. It never was. The archivist nodded. It is the bridge that allows memory to become hope. Rowan whispered, and if that bridge breaks, every fear becomes permanent, the witch said. Every grief becomes endless. Every mistake becomes identity. She gestured toward the frightened young man who had once been a crimson-eyed creature. Enough centuries living that way, and eventually even your own name disappears. The young man looked up at her with tears filling his eyes. My name. He pressed trembling fingers against his forehead. I almost remembered it. Tomorrow knelt beside him. Don't force it. She gently took his hand. Names return more easily when someone is waiting to hear them. The young man stared at her. After several silent moments he whispered, Elias. The name echoed strangely through the cavern. Somewhere in the distance another crimson-eyed creature stumbled, paused, and looked around in confusion before continuing its frantic flight. The archivist observed the reaction carefully. The chain has begun. Seraphine frowned. What chain? Remembrance. Before anyone could ask further, a piercing cry echoed from high above the shattered mountain. It was not human. Shadows swept across the opening in the ceiling. Rowan looked upward just as an enormous winged shape descended through the dust. At first he mistook it for a dragon, but its body was leaner, feathered rather than scaled, with wings broad enough to eclipse the daylight pouring into the cavern. White feathers shimmered with streaks of silver. For golden eyes scanned the destruction below. The creature landed gracefully on a fractured ledge, folding wings that seemed woven from clouds. Soldiers from both armies instinctively raised weapons. The winged being ignored them. It bowed its head toward Tomorrow. We heard. Its voice carried the musical cadence of distant bells. Tomorrow brightened immediately. You're still here. Very few of us. The great bird looked toward the witch. Keeper. Then toward the giant. First voice. Finally it noticed the humans. Curiosity flickered across all four eyes. More have awakened than expected. Rowan blinked. What is it? Aldrin answered in astonishment. I've seen carvings. Seraphine looked equally stunned. Impossible. The witch supplied the name. A sky warden. The immense bird ruffled its feathers. I preferred messenger. Rowan stepped closer despite himself. I thought your kind were myths. The bird tilted its head. Myths are memories wearing masks. Before Rowan could reply, more cries echoed across the sky. Dozens of immense silhouettes circled above the ruined mountain. Some resembled giant birds. Others possessed long ribbon-like bodies gliding through the air without wings. One looked almost like a whale swimming through clouds. They did not attack. They gathered. Watching. Waiting. Seraphine stared upward. How many hidden things are left in this world? The archivist answered with complete seriousness. Far fewer than yesterday. A sudden sharp pain shot through the witch. She staggered, catching herself against broken stone. Rowan rushed toward her. What's wrong? She looked at her own hands. The silver markings across her skin had begun flickering erratically. The prison. Rowan followed her gaze. Only two colossal chains still bound the first voice. Yet beneath the mountain fresh cracks raced through the abyss at terrifying speed. Entire sections of reality itself appeared unstable, edges of stone blurring before snapping back into focus. The giant watched the fractures quietly. The old foundation is dying. Tomorrow's smile faded. It won't last much longer. Rowan looked desperately from one immortal to another. Then finish freeing him. Not yet, the witch answered. Why not? She pointed toward the escaping crimsonite figures disappearing into distant forests. Because if I remove the final chains now. Rowan waited. Every forgotten memory in the world will return at once. Aldrin frowned. Wouldn't that help? The archivist shook its head. Imagine every grief your ancestors ever carried arriving inside your mind in a single heartbeat. Seraphine slowly lowered her sword. People would go mad. Most would, the witch admitted. Memory heals only when it returns at a pace the heart can survive. Rowan looked at the last two chains binding the first voice, then toward the endless horizon where creatures and people alike were already changing because of a single touch between tomorrow and one lost soul. The choice before them had grown even more impossible than before. They no longer needed merely to save the world. They needed to teach it how to remember itself before its own forgotten past destroyed it. For several moments no one spoke because every answer that had once seemed obvious had dissolved into a maze of impossible consequences. The mountain continued breaking apart around them, yet the urgency had changed. At first they had feared monsters escaping a prison. Now they understood that those same monsters had once been ordinary people whose memories had been stripped away over ages too vast to imagine. The enemy was no longer a creature that could simply be slain. It was forgetting itself. Rowan looked across the valley through the widening fractures in the mountainside. Far below, one crimsonite figure had stopped beside a stream instead of continuing its frantic flight. It knelt at the water's edge, staring into its reflection with visible confusion. Another creature emerged from the trees behind it. Rather than attacking, it hesitated. The first pointed uncertainly toward its own face as though asking a question neither could answer. The second slowly lowered its claws. For a heartbeat they resembled two lost travelers meeting on an unfamiliar road rather than horrors escaped from an ancient abyss. Then panic returned. They fled in opposite directions, disappearing beneath the forest. Canopy. Rowan exhaled slowly. They're changing already. Only the nearest, the archivist replied. Tomorrow's touch reached farther than expected. The child looked embarrassed by the attention. She sat on the edge of a broken shelf in the ruined library below, gently swinging her feet as though the mountain were not collapsing around her. The carved wooden bird remained in her hands. She ran one finger across its worn wings with surprising affection. I missed stories, she said quietly. Rowan climbed down into the library and stopped a respectful distance away. Do you remember who carved that toy? She nodded. A father. Do you remember his name? She frowned in concentration before shaking her head. Not anymore. Rowan found that strangely sad. But you said you remember everyone. I do. She looked up at him with calm sincerity. People fade when nobody speaks their names. Rowan knelt beside her. Can they come back? Sometimes. She held the little bird toward him. If enough pieces are found. He accepted the toy carefully. It was unexpectedly warm despite the cold cavern. Tiny scratches covered its surface. At first they looked random. Then he noticed faint letters carved beneath one wing. They were worn almost smooth by time, but one word remained legible. Elian. Rowan frowned. Is this the father's name? Tomorrow smiled. No. The child's? No. Then whose? The bird. Rowan blinked. he named the toy? Of course. She sounded genuinely puzzled by the question. Everything used to have a name. Rowan glanced toward the archivist. Everything? The silverite figure nodded. Mountains. Rivers. Bridges. Wells. Every path between villages. Every tree planted by human hands. Every bell. Every ship. Aldrin overheard the conversation as he descended into the library. That's impossible. It was considered polite, the archivist corrected. People remembered more carefully when they addressed the world instead of merely using it. Seraphine joined them, surveying the empty shelves lining the chamber. And we forgot all of that? Not immediately. The witch stepped down beside them, still holding the ancient gray blade. Forgetting never begins with names. She touched one abandoned shelf. Dust swirled away, revealing a faded inscription. It begins with gratitude. Rowan read the worn carving aloud. Return what was borrowed. He looked around. This was a library. Once. The witch's fingers lingered on the inscription. But before books disappeared, people borrowed memories from one another. Rowan frowned. I don't understand. When someone grew too old to remember every lesson they had learned, they would place one memory here. She looked toward the endless empty shelves. Another person would borrow it until they had no further need of it, then return it for someone else. Aldrin folded his arms skeptically. Human memories? Not stolen. Shared. Tomorrow corrected him gently. Seraphine examined one vacant shelf. Then who emptied this place? The archivist answered without hesitation. Fear. Rowan looked around at the vast chamber. Fear of what? Loss. The archivist's white eyes reflected the ruined library. People eventually decided that forgetting painful memories would be kinder than carrying them. The witch sighed. So they stopped returning them. Rowan felt a chill unrelated to the cold. They kept only the happy ones. At first. The archivist nodded. Then someone decided painful history should also disappear. Aldrin stared silently at the empty shelves. Then wars were forgotten. And repeated. Seraphine finished quietly. The archivist inclined its head. Again. And again. No one argued. The silence itself became an admission. Above them another distant cry echoed through the sky. One of the enormous sky wardens descended through the fractured ceiling, landing with graceful precision beside the first. This newcomer possessed midnight blue feathers that shimmered with faint stars despite the daylight pouring through the broken mountain. Unlike the first messenger, this one carried several leather satchels secured beneath its wings. It lowered itself before tomorrow. We brought what survived. Carefully, it opened the satchels. Rowan expected food or supplies. Instead, dozens of strange objects spilled gently across the stone floor. A cracked clay whistle. A child's shoe. A broken compass. A silver spoon blackened with age. A faded ribbon. A rusted key. None possessed obvious value. Tomorrow gasped with delight. You found them. The messenger nodded. The hidden keepers guarded them well. Rowan picked up the compass. Its needle did not point north. It spun slowly before settling toward tomorrow instead. What are these? Lost beginnings, the bird replied. Rowan looked confused. The witch knelt beside the scattered objects. Every civilization preserved treasures. She held up the plain silver spoon. Most chose gold. She smiled sadly. Some chose ordinary mornings. Rowan frowned. This is just a spoon. A mother used it every day for 60 years before giving it to her daughter. The witch turned it over. Tiny scratches lined the handle. She measured medicine with it when her husband became ill. She stirred soup with it during harsh winters. She tapped it against the table every birthday because her children laughed when she did. Rowan stared at the simple utensil differently. How do you know all that? Because objects remember being loved. Seraphine slowly picked up the faded ribbon. Then why save these instead of crowns or jewels? Tomorrow answered. Because kingdoms disappear. She tied the ribbon around one wrist. Breakfast doesn't. Rowan found himself smiling despite everything surrounding them. The feeling lasted only a moment. A scream echoed from above. Everyone rushed toward the opening overlooking the valley. Smoke rose from a nearby village hidden among the pines. Figures ran through the streets. At first Rowan assumed the crimson-eyed creatures had attacked. Then he noticed something worse. The villagers were attacking one another. One man clutched his head while shouting that strangers had stolen his childhood. Another insisted he suddenly remembered crimes committed by people standing beside him decades before. An elderly woman embraced someone who had died 40 years earlier because, to her, he appeared alive again. The returning memories were arriving unevenly, colliding with the present until nobody could distinguish yesterday from today. Aldrin gripped the edge of the broken cliff. It's already happening. The archivist closed its eyes. Too quickly. The witch looked toward tomorrow. Can you slow it? The child shook her head sadly. Not from here. Then what? Rowan asked. Tomorrow looked at the tiny collection of ordinary objects scattered across the library floor. People remember stories more gently than truth. Rowan frowned. Meaning? The Sky Warden answered. If memories return through songs, through tales, through keepsakes. It spread one great wing toward the valley. Hearts accept them. Seraphine slowly understood. But if they arrive all at once? They break. Silence settled once more. Rowan looked at the scattered objects, then toward the frightened villages below, then back at tomorrow. An idea began forming. If memories need stories. He turned toward the witch. Then someone has to tell them. She studied him carefully. Yes. Not in one place. Rowan's thoughts raced. Everywhere. Aldrin followed his reasoning. Travelers. Seraphine added another piece. Messengers. The Sky Warden spread its wings proudly. Singers. Tomorrow smiled brighter than Rowan had yet seen. Storytellers. Rowan looked across the vast horizon where beacon lights still burned from kingdom to kingdom, warning every nation of disaster. Then we don't just need an army. The witch's tired eyes met his. No. Rowan tightened his grip around the little carved bird named Elian. We need the world to remember itself before fear teaches it the wrong story. The idea settled over the chamber with surprising weight because it sounded absurd beside the scale of the catastrophe unfolding outside. Mountains were breaking apart, forgotten creatures wandered through forests, kingdoms had awakened ancient beacons for the first time in living memory, and yet the answer before them was not another weapon or another prison. It was stories. Seraphine was the first to voice the doubt everyone else felt. Stories require years. She looked toward the smoke rising from the villages below. Those people may not survive until nightfall. Rowan could not argue. The screams carried upward on the wind, mixed with the frantic ringing of church bells and the frightened cries of livestock breaking loose from their pens. The witch walked to the fractured edge of the cavern and watched the valley for several silent breaths. Then she spoke without turning around. Do you know why songs spread faster than laws? Nobody answered. Because people repeat songs to comfort themselves. Laws are repeated only when someone is afraid. She looked back at them. Hope travels farther than commands if it is given a voice. Aldrin rested both hands on the pommel of his sword. Hope won't stop a village tearing itself apart. No, the witch agreed. But one remembered name might. The frightened young man who had recovered his identity, Elias, slowly rose to his feet. He still looked exhausted, as though centuries of nightmare lingered behind his eyes, but his breathing had steadied. I remember something else. Everyone turned toward him. He pressed trembling fingers against his temples. Not clearly. Pieces. The archivist approached. Speak them before they fade. Elias closed his eyes. There were gatherings. His voice remained uncertain. Whenever someone returned from a journey, they didn't begin with news. He frowned. They began with a name. Tomorrow smiled encouragingly. Keep going. They would ask. His expression brightened with recognition. Who should be remembered tonight? The words echoed softly through the ruined library. Rowan felt something shift inside him. Not vague emotion, but the unmistakable sense that the sentence belonged somewhere deep within every human heart. Elias continued. One person would stand. They would tell a story about someone who wasn't present. Maybe a grandmother. Maybe a stranger who once helped them cross a river. Maybe a child who had planted a tree. When the story ended, tears rolled down his face. Everyone repeated the person's name together. Silence followed. Even the mountain seemed quieter. The archivist inclined its head. The evenings of return. The witch closed her eyes briefly. I had forgotten what they were called. Rowan looked at her in disbelief. You forgot too? She gave a tired smile. Immortality protects many things. Memory is not one of them. Seraphine stared at Elias. You're saying entire communities gathered simply to remember ordinary people? There were no ordinary people, Tomorrow answered gently. Only ordinary days. The sky warden nearest the opening suddenly lifted its head. Its 4 golden eyes narrowed toward the eastern horizon. Visitors. A distant shape approached through the clouds. Then another. Then dozens more. At first Rowan assumed more sky wardens had answered the call, but these moved differently. Their wings beat with mechanical precision. Sunlight flashed from polished metal rather than feathers. Seraphine recognized them instantly. Siege gliders. Aldrin cursed under his breath. Already? The gliders emerged fully from the clouds, long wooden craft suspended beneath enormous canvas wings reinforced with bronze ribs. Each carried squads of armored soldiers. Banners streamed behind them in colors Rowan did not recognize. There were too many to count at first glance. Some bore the black crimson-marked standards of the Ash Dominion. Others displayed green forests, white towers, blue waves, golden suns, symbols from kingdoms separated by centuries of hatred. They flew together in uneasy formation, maintaining careful distance from one another while converging upon the shattered mountain. Rowan frowned. They answered the beacons. Faster than expected, Aldrin muttered. The first glider landed roughly upon a surviving ledge near the broken monastery above. More circled overhead searching for stable ground. Within minutes the ruins filled with soldiers speaking different languages, wearing different armor, glaring suspiciously at former enemies while climbing toward the cavern below. Their weapons remained drawn despite sharing the same destination. Seraphine sighed. Old habits. The witch watched them without enthusiasm. The world has gathered. Isn't that what we wanted? Rowan asked. Eventually. She looked at the growing armies. They have come prepared to fight a war they no longer understand. The prediction proved correct almost immediately. As commanders descended into the cavern and witnessed the Free Witch standing beside the partially released first voice, confusion erupted into argument. Kill the prisoner, shouted one general wearing emerald armor. Secure the artifact, ordered another. Seal the breach. Capture the child. Destroy the giant. Dozens of contradictory commands echoed simultaneously. Soldiers shifted uncertainly, unsure whose authority outweighed another's. Within moments drawn swords pointed not only at the immortals but at one another. Aldrin stepped between opposing formations. Stand down. Nobody listened. Seraphine attempted the same. If you fight here, the mountain, a captain interrupted her. Your dominion started this. Your kingdom buried the truth, another shouted back. Voices rose. Shields locked. Rowan felt panic building again. They're going to start a battle. No, Tomorrow said quietly. Rowan looked at her. The child walked calmly toward the center of the chamber carrying only the little wooden bird. Hundreds of soldiers noticed her. Their arguments gradually faltered. She climbed onto a fallen block of white stone so everyone could see her despite her small size. May I tell you something? She asked. Nobody answered. She continued anyway. Once there was a baker. Several commanders frowned in confusion. Every morning he burned the first loaf of bread. A few soldiers exchanged puzzled glances. His neighbors thought he was foolish because flour was expensive. They laughed at him every day. Tomorrow held up the carved bird. One little girl finally asked why. The cavern had grown unexpectedly quiet. Even the soldiers seemed curious despite themselves. The baker smiled and pointed toward the road leaving the village. Because someone hungry always arrives after sunrise, he said. She looked around at the gathered armies. For 23 years nobody came. Rowan noticed several soldiers lowering their weapons without realizing it. Tomorrow continued. People told him to stop wasting bread. His own children begged him to save the flour. She smiled softly. On the 24th year, a boy walked into the village after surviving a war. Absolute silence now filled the cavern. He hadn't eaten for 5 days. The child looked down at the wooden bird in her hands. The bread was already waiting. One old soldier from a northern kingdom slowly removed his helmet. His weathered face had become strangely distant. My grandfather. He whispered. Tears filled his eyes. He told me that story. A woman wearing Ash Dominion armor stared at him. Mine too. Another voice spoke from the back. My mother changed the ending. Someone else laughed through unexpected tears. So did mine. Rowan looked around in astonishment. Across the cavern, strangers from enemy kingdoms had begun finishing one another's memories. Not perfectly. Each version differed slightly. One baker had a daughter instead of a son. One village stood beside the sea instead of a forest. Yet the heart of the tale remained unchanged. The archivist smiled for the first time. There. Rowan whispered, what's happening? Memory chooses stories before facts. The witch answered. Always. The arguments faded. Weapons lowered. Not because anyone had surrendered, but because for one fragile moment they no longer saw enemies standing across from them. They saw people who had inherited the same forgotten tale through different generations. Tomorrow stepped down from the stone. The boy became a baker too, she finished quietly. Because someone remembered to leave bread waiting. No applause followed. None was needed. The silence itself had changed. It no longer carried suspicion. It carried recognition. Then, from somewhere far beyond the mountain, another voice spoke the word that had been echoing across the world since the crimson-eyed creatures began awakening. This time it did not come from monsters. It came from thousands of ordinary people scattered across valleys and cities, speaking together without knowing why. Remember. And as the sound rolled over the land, the first soldier in the cavern turned toward a former enemy, extended his hand instead of his sword, and said the simplest sentence any of them had spoken all day. Tell me someone I shouldn't forget. Night settled gently over the flowering grove, and the travelers remained in the circular plaza long after the meal had ended. Nobody hurried to extinguish the lanterns. Instead, people lingered in clusters, trading stories that had nothing to do with ancient prophecies or forgotten cities. A shepherd explained how sheep recognized individual whistles. A sailor described the strange silence that fell over the ocean just before dawn. An elderly woman demonstrated 3 different ways to mend a torn sleeve using only one piece of thread. Rowan realized that for the first time since leaving home, conversations were no longer dominated by survival. They had begun making room for living again. The first voice rested beyond the plaza where the silver trees opened into a broad meadow. Children climbed carefully across the giant's living terraces under the watchful eyes of patient parents. The immense being answered every question with complete seriousness, whether asked by scholars or 7-year-olds. Rowan wandered over just in time to hear a little girl ask, "What's the biggest thing you've ever carried?" The giant considered the question thoughtfully. "A goodbye." The children waited for an explanation. The first voice smiled. "It weighed less than a feather while I was carrying it." Its golden eyes drifted toward the distant sea. "It became heavy only after I put it down." Even the children seemed to understand more than the words themselves. One little boy quietly reached over and hugged his grandfather's arm. Nearby, Tomorrow sat cross-legged beside a shallow pool fed by fresh spring water bubbling up through ancient stone. She floated tiny paper boats across its surface instead of paper cranes. Rowan sat beside her. "New project?" She nodded. "The birds have work to do." Rowan watched the miniature boats drift lazily toward the edge of the pool before circling back again. Each carried one small candle protected by a folded leaf. "Where are these going?" Tomorrow smiled. "Nowhere." Rowan looked puzzled. "Then why make them?" She gently nudged another boat into the water. "Not every journey needs a destination." Rowan laughed. "You really enjoy answering questions that way." "No." She watched the candles reflecting in the dark water. "I enjoy questions that keep walking after the answer ends." Before Rowan could respond, one of the harbor keepers approached carrying a long wooden case wrapped carefully in faded blue cloth. It was Elian, the keeper with the ring of bronze keys. She bowed slightly toward Tomorrow. "It's time." Tomorrow nodded eagerly. "Already?" Elian smiled. The tide agreed. Rowan looked between them. "Time for what?" Neither answered directly. Instead, Elian carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing an instrument unlike anything Rowan had ever seen. At first glance it resembled a violin, yet its body had been carved from pale driftwood streaked with silver veins, and instead of 4 strings it held 7, each made from a different shimmering material. The bow appeared woven from strands of white horsehair mixed with feathers so fine they almost disappeared in the lantern light. Rowan stared. "What is it?" Elian lifted the instrument with unmistakable reverence. "A tide fiddle." The name spread quietly through nearby listeners. Several harbor keepers instinctively removed their hats. Even the archivist wandered closer. Rowan frowned. "I've never heard of one." "Very few people have." Elian rested the instrument against her shoulder. "It only plays when coastlines change." She drew the bow gently across the highest string. One clear note floated into the night. It sounded almost ordinary until the returning sea answered. Somewhere beyond the grove, waves rolled softly against stone in perfect rhythm with the music. Another note followed. Then another. Gradually the melody expanded until Rowan could no longer tell whether the fiddle guided the tide or the tide guided the fiddle. Water shimmered beneath moonlight. The blossoms drifting from the silver trees changed direction, swirling gently around the musician before continuing toward the sea. People throughout the plaza fell silent. No one applauded. The music did not seem written for audiences. It felt more like a conversation between old companions finally reunited after a very long separation. As the melody unfolded, Rowan noticed subtle changes around him. The spring beside Tomorrow began overflowing slightly, though no rain had fallen. Tiny fish appeared within the clear water. Despite the pool having been empty moments before. Moss spread across dry stones in delicate green patterns. Even the stars overhead seemed reflected more brightly in every puddle and stream. The witch closed her eyes. "The waters are remembering their names." Rowan whispered, "Can water remember?" She opened one eye. "You've never returned to a river from childhood?" Rowan nodded slowly. "Then you already know the answer." The music continued until the final note dissolved into the whisper of the distant tide. Silence lingered for several heartbeats. Then everyone heard it. Footsteps. Not approaching from the road. From beneath it. Rowan stood immediately. Others did the same. The sound was unmistakable. Slow. Even. Countless footsteps echoing somewhere deep below the ancient paving stones. Aldrin instinctively reached for his sword before stopping himself halfway. He had almost forgotten he no longer carried one. Seraphine knelt and placed her hand upon the white stone. I can feel them. Rowan looked around. Who's down there? The harbor keepers exchanged calm glances rather than fearful ones. Elian gently lowered the tied fiddle. They're early. Rowan blinked. Who? She smiled softly. The roadmakers. The name stirred recognition in the first voice. The giant inclined its immense head respectfully toward the ground beneath the plaza. The footsteps grew clearer. Not threatening. Rhythmic. Like workers crossing a bridge together at dawn. Then, directly at the center of the great sundial, one white stone slowly lifted by itself. Another followed. Then another. Instead of bursting upward, the stones carefully rearranged themselves, revealing a circular opening descending into warm golden light. Rowan peered cautiously inside. He expected caverns. Instead he saw stairs. Perfectly clean. Freshly swept. Lanterns already burning along the walls though no visible hands had lit them. A pleasant scent of cedar drifted upward. Someone below was humming. Elian smiled. They're finished. Rowan looked at her. Finished with what? The next road. Tomorrow stood at once, delighted. Can we see? Elian nodded. Of course. The harbor keepers did not hesitate. One by one they began descending the illuminated staircase. Rowan glanced toward the witch. She merely smiled and gestured for him to follow. The passage beneath the plaza felt nothing like a forgotten ruin. Warm light reflected from polished stone walls decorated with simple carvings of hands building bridges, planting trees, repairing roofs, and carrying children across streams. No battles. No kings. No monsters. Just ordinary work performed with extraordinary care. The humming grew louder until Rowan reached the bottom of the stairs. There, stretching beyond sight, lay an enormous underground workshop unlike anything he had imagined. Hundreds of men and women moved calmly among long wooden tables covered with maps, measuring cords, chisels, seeds, compasses, and bundles of young saplings. Some shaped paving stones. Others painted tiny symbols onto signposts. A few patiently repaired old boots left behind by travelers who had never returned to claim them. Nobody seemed surprised by the visitors. One gray-haired woman looked up from carving a milestone and smiled. You're just in time. Rowan stared in amazement. For what? She handed him a hammer polished smooth by generations of use. The world keeps getting bigger. Her smile widened. We'll need help building tomorrow's roads. Rowan accepted the hammer almost automatically, though he had no idea what kind of work he had just agreed to. It was surprisingly light, its wooden handle warm as if another pair of hands had been using it only moments before. He turned it over and noticed hundreds of tiny names carved so delicately into the grain that they resembled the growth rings of an old tree. Whose hammer is this? He asked. The gray-haired woman brushed stone dust from her apron. Whoever needs it next. Rowan looked closer. None of the names appeared scratched in by ownership. They had been added one after another. Across generations, each no larger than a grain of rice. Did all these people build roads? The woman smiled. Some built roads. She nodded toward another workbench where a young man carefully repaired a broken lantern. Some made sure people could see them. She gestured toward an elderly tailor sewing heavy winter cloaks. Some kept travelers warm. Then toward a laughing girl painting colorful symbols on wooden signposts. Some made sure children didn't get lost. Rowan slowly understood. Every tool here belonged not to a profession but to a purpose. Across the immense underground hall, dozens of long tables displayed maps unlike any Rowan had ever seen. They contained rivers, forests, villages, mountain passes, and coastlines, but none of them stopped where parchment ended. Instead, faint unfinished lines extended beyond the edges, continuing onto the tables themselves where artisans patiently carved future routes directly into polished wood. Rowan approached one enormous map stretching nearly 30 feet across. Tiny bronze figures stood upon it, each representing a traveler. To his astonishment, they moved. Not magically, but mechanically, advancing along delicate grooves with slow, precise clicks. Every time two miniature travelers reached the same crossroads, the tiny figures turned toward one another before continuing on their journeys. Rowan leaned closer. Why do they stop? A white-bearded man adjusting one of the mechanisms answered without looking up. To ask directions. Rowan smiled. Even if they already know the way? Especially then. The old craftsman finally looked at him with bright, amused eyes. A road isn't only for arriving. He gently nudged one little bronze traveler whose path had become blocked by another figure. Sometimes it's where strangers become less strange. Nearby, Seraphine had become fascinated by an enormous wall covered entirely in keys. Thousands of them hung from neatly labeled hooks. Tiny iron keys. Massive bronze gate keys. Delicate silver keys no larger than sewing needles. She turned toward Elian. You weren't exaggerating. Elian laughed. About which part? Seraphine pointed toward the wall. You really do keep keys for conversations. Elian walked over and removed one slender copper key tied with a faded green ribbon. This one. She held it thoughtfully. Belonged to two sisters. Rowan wandered closer. What did it open? Nothing. Elian smiled gently. That's why they needed it. Rowan frowned. She continued, neither sister spoke to the other for 21 years. She placed the key into Rowan's hand. It bore no teeth, making it incapable of opening any ordinary lock. One day they both arrived at the same roadside house. Rowan remembered the little houses marked with open hands. The places where travelers shared meals. Elian nodded. They spent 6 hours inside. What happened? Mostly silence. She smiled fondly. Then one sister asked whether the other still remembered how to whistle. Rowan blinked. That's all? That was enough. Elian accepted the key back and returned it to its hook. The lock wasn't on the door. Rowan found himself smiling long after they walked away. Deeper within the workshop, the steady rhythm of chisels echoed like distant rain. The harbor keepers moved naturally among the artisans, greeting many by name. Rowan quietly asked the witch, how long have they been down here? She looked around the vast chamber. Some. She pointed toward a middle-aged mason carefully fitting white stones together. 3 weeks. Then toward an elderly woman polishing brass compasses. Perhaps 400 years. Rowan stopped walking. 400? The witch nodded calmly. Roadmakers don't measure time the way kingdoms do. How? She rested her fingertips against one of the carved walls. They measure unfinished journeys. Before Rowan could ask another question, a cheerful voice called across the workshop. New arrivals. Heads lifted from every direction. Instead of interrupting their work, people simply smiled in greeting before returning to whatever they had been building. No one demanded introductions. No one questioned where the travelers had come from. It was simply understood that anyone who found this place had arrived because a road had eventually led them here. Tomorrow wandered toward a long workbench where several elderly women were folding enormous sheets of pale paper. Rowan followed curiously. More cranes? One woman laughed. Too small. She unfolded the sheet. It expanded until it covered nearly the entire table. With astonishing speed her hands began folding impossible angles. Others joined in, adding careful creases until the paper transformed into something Rowan had never imagined. A map. Not drawn. Folded. Rivers rose as ridges. Mountains formed from layered paper. Valleys appeared as graceful depressions. Tiny villages emerged with nothing more than clever bends. Rowan stared in admiration. That's incredible. Tomorrow gently traced one paper road with her fingertip. Every fold changes every other fold. Rowan looked up. Like people. The old women exchanged pleased glances. Exactly. At the far end of the chamber stood the largest doorway Rowan had yet seen. Unlike the ancient white ring at the harbor, this entrance was made entirely of unfinished wood. Above it hung a plain sign carved with 3 simple words. Not yet open. Curious, Rowan approached. The door had no handle. Only a smooth wooden surface still carrying the scent of fresh cedar. A young carpenter sanding its frame looked up. Beautiful, isn't it? Rowan nodded. Where does it lead? The carpenter shrugged happily. No idea. Rowan laughed. You're building a door without knowing what's beyond it. Of course. The carpenter brushed sawdust from his sleeves. Every worthwhile door gets built before anyone knows exactly who will need it. Rowan touched the smooth wood. It felt solid, reassuring. When will it open? The carpenter smiled. The day someone arrives convinced it can't. Rowan stepped back, thinking about how many impossible things had already happened simply because people refused to abandon hope before evidence appeared. Across the workshop, bells chimed softly 3 times. Work gradually paused. Not because the day had ended, but because everyone instinctively gathered around a broad circular table occupying the center of the hall. Maps were rolled aside. Tools were neatly stacked. Fresh bread appeared from somewhere Rowan hadn't noticed. Clay mugs filled with fragrant tea passed from hand to hand. The gray-haired woman who had first given Rowan the hammer climbed onto a little stool so everyone could see her. She smiled around the gathering. Daily question. Hundreds of people settled comfortably. Rowan whispered to Aldrin, "Do they always do this?" Aldrin shrugged. "I'm beginning to suspect every place worth visiting has traditions no one's bothered writing down." The gray-haired woman looked around the circle. What became easier today? Rowan expected complicated philosophical answers. Instead, a young apprentice raised his hand. Remembering names. A cartographer smiled. Asking for directions. An elderly mason chuckled. Admitting I measured that arch wrong. Laughter spread warmly. A child proudly announced, sharing my blanket. A harbor keeper added, saying goodbye without pretending it wasn't goodbye. Each answer was different. None sounded rehearsed. Rowan listened quietly until the woman noticed him. And you? Hundreds of kind eyes turned toward him without pressure or expectation. Rowan thought for a long moment. Finally he smiled. Waiting. The room became very still. Then, one by one, people around the table nodded. Not because it was the best answer, but because they understood exactly what he meant. The gray-haired woman gently tapped the table once. Good. She looked around at everyone gathered beneath the earth. Then tomorrow we build something that deserves it. And throughout the vast underground workshop, where roads to places not yet discovered were patiently taking shape beneath careful hands, chisels, lanterns, folded maps, and quiet conversations, work resumed with renewed purpose, not to finish the world, but to make sure that whoever walked into its next chapter would always find a welcoming path waiting ahead. When the gathering dispersed, no one rushed back to the same task they had been doing before. Rowan noticed people quietly exchanging places instead. The cartographer who had spent the morning drawing coastlines now helped a blacksmith straighten bent nails. The elderly tailor wandered over to teach 2 apprentices how to repair a cracked leather satchel. One of the roadmakers left his stone carving unfinished to help children polish brass mile markers until they reflected lantern light like tiny suns. Rowan found the change curious. He turned to the gray-haired woman. Why does everyone switch jobs? She smiled as though she had been waiting for someone to ask. Because if you only ever build roads. She nodded toward the masons, you eventually forget who walks them. She pointed toward the cooks. And if you only feed travelers. Then toward the mapmakers, you forget how difficult it is to find the kitchen. Rowan laughed. So everyone learns everything? Not everything. She gently adjusted a young apprentice's grip on a hammer as she passed. Just enough to become grateful. The sentence stayed with Rowan as he wandered deeper into the workshop. Gratitude, he realized, had become strangely visible in this place. It appeared in the careful sharpening of tools that belonged to strangers. In the way every chair was pushed neatly beneath its table for whoever came next. In the polished handrails worn smooth by countless palms. Nobody seemed to work for applause. They worked because they genuinely expected someone they would never meet to benefit from what they were doing. At the far end of the hall, a steady knocking echoed from behind a row of unfinished archways. Curious, Rowan followed the sound until he reached a chamber unlike the others. There were no maps, no tools, no stone dust. Instead, thousands of clocks lined the walls. Grandfather clocks taller than a man. Tiny pocket watches. Water clocks dripping into crystal bowls. Sand glasses of every imaginable size. Yet none of them displayed the same time. Some moved rapidly, their hands spinning almost playfully. Others had not advanced a single minute in what looked like years. Several appeared to be running backward. Rowan stared in fascination. An elderly man sat alone at the center of the room carefully repairing the delicate gears inside a tiny silver watch. Without looking up he asked, "Which one bothers you?" Rowan blinked. "What? Everyone chooses one." The old craftsman smiled faintly. "Which clock makes you uncomfortable?" Rowan slowly walked around the chamber. His eyes settled on an enormous clock standing in the corner. It had no hands. Only a smooth empty face surrounded by beautifully carved wood. That one. The old man finally looked up. Ah. He nodded approvingly. Good choice. Rowan frowned. It's broken. No. The craftsman returned to his work. It's waiting. Rowan approached the silent clock. Waiting for what? The first person who asks what time it isn't. Rowan laughed softly. That doesn't make any sense. Most useful questions don't at first. The old man gently placed another gear into the tiny watch. People spend their lives asking what time it is. He glanced toward the empty-faced clock. Very few ask what has finally stopped needing to hurry. Rowan looked again at the motionless face. For reasons he could not explain, it no longer seemed broken. It seemed peaceful. As Rowan left the chamber, he almost collided with Seraphine carrying an armful of neatly rolled blueprints. There you are. She balanced the scrolls against one shoulder. Come see this. She led him through several winding corridors until they emerged into an immense underground gallery. At first Rowan thought it was empty. Then he noticed the models. Hundreds of them. Entire towns crafted in astonishing detail from wood, clay, glass, woven reeds, polished stone, even folded paper. Miniature bridges crossed tiny rivers. Windmills turned slowly in unseen currents of air. Little gardens bloomed with living moss. Rowan leaned closer to one beautifully carved village nestled beside a lake. These are incredible. Seraphine nodded. Look at the labels. Rowan examined the small brass plaque beneath the model. Not built. He moved to another. Still imagined. Another. Waiting for someone to need it. Rowan looked around the gallery in amazement. These aren't replicas. No. Seraphine smiled. They're possibilities. A young architect approached carrying a box of colored tiles. Would you like to add something? Rowan hesitated. I don't know anything about designing towns. Perfect. The architect handed him a tiny blue tile. Then you'll notice what we've forgotten. Rowan looked uncertainly across the largest model in the room. It depicted a thriving city with elegant streets, beautiful homes, markets, gardens, schools, and workshops. Everything appeared thoughtfully arranged. Yet something felt missing. He walked slowly around it before finally placing the blue tile beside a narrow stream running through the city. Here. The architect crouched beside him. What's that? Rowan shrugged. A bench. The architect blinked. A bench? Rowan nodded. Somewhere people don't have to buy anything. Somewhere they can simply sit. Silence lingered. The architect smiled broadly. We've redesigned this city for 12 years. She looked around at her fellow planners. Not one of us remembered a bench. Laughter spread through the gallery. Another architect immediately fetched tiny carving tools. We'll need more than one. Soon several people were discussing where benches should overlook rivers, where old friends might meet after years apart, where tired travelers could rest without being expected to move on. Rowan watched the miniature city quietly change because of one simple observation. He realized that civilizations were often transformed not by grand inventions but by someone noticing an ordinary kindness that everyone else had overlooked. A bell rang softly somewhere beyond the gallery. Not urgent. Merely inviting. The roadmakers began gathering their tools. Elian appeared carrying her ring of bronze keys. Come. Rowan looked around. Another meeting? A tour. She smiled mischievously. Of tomorrow. She led a small group through a narrow tunnel descending even deeper beneath the earth. The air gradually became warmer. Instead of lanterns, soft golden crystals embedded within the walls illuminated the passage. Eventually the tunnel opened onto a breathtaking cavern so vast that Rowan could not see its far end. His breath caught. Roads. Hundreds of them. They stretched across the cavern in graceful curves and gentle slopes, suspended over underground rivers, disappearing into shimmering mist, crossing elegant bridges supported by pillars carved to resemble growing trees. None of the roads appeared finished. Some ended halfway across empty space. Others faded into untouched stone. Yet workers calmly continued laying fresh paving stones as though the destinations already existed. Rowan whispered, "Where do they go?" Elian answered with unmistakable pride. "Somewhere." Rowan smiled. "That's not very specific." "It doesn't have to be yet." She pointed toward one unfinished bridge reaching into open darkness. "That one didn't exist yesterday." Rowan looked closer. Fresh mortar still glistened between the newest stones. "Who asked for it?" Elian gently shook her head. "Nobody." He turned toward her in confusion. She looked out across the endless web of unfinished roads. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the kindest thing you can do is build the bridge before the traveler realizes they'll need to cross it." Rowan stood in silence, watching hundreds of patient builders continue their work beneath the sleeping world, creating paths toward places no map could yet name, trusting with complete confidence that one day, perhaps years from now or centuries beyond their own lives, someone frightened, hopeful, lonely, joyful, or simply curious would arrive at the edge of one unfinished road and discover, with profound relief, that a stranger they would never meet had already begun making a way forward.